Well, hi, Facebook friends and YouTube friends. I'm excited to be with you tonight to continue our work on the Advent story, the Christmas story. And we are hoping to go live on Instagram. And so just give me a minute and I'm going to go live over there. We're trying some new technology. So let me know I'm live on Facebook. You know the drill. We always say hi. So thank you, Karen, for letting me know we're live there. So I'm going to go live on Instagram and see what happens. There we go. It looks like we're live on Instagram too. Welcome, Instagram friends. We're so glad you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about how our story intersects with God's story and how that impacts our story, both in a positive and a negative way. You know, so often I think that we believe that we don't have choices in our story. And I've been pondering this Advent story for a couple of weeks now. And I want us to understand through these three big biblical characters that we're going to talk about: Zechariah, we're going to talk about Mary on Friday, but today we're going to be talking about Elizabeth. I want us to understand that these are just regular people, just like us, and that they had choices and we have choices about how we interact with God's story, and how we choose impacts our part of the story. And I think this is really important because so many times we live and act like victims, like we have no say in the story, no choices, no power. But that's not true. We do have choices to make. And so I want to talk today about the choices we make and how that impacts our story using this familiar Christmas story. Because Mary and Elizabeth and Zechariah are three normal human beings who had choices to make when God invited them to participate in his larger story. Now, yesterday I talked about Zechariah in the first chapter of Luke, and here's a short review. Zechariah was probably the most prominent man in this story, the only man. The other two are women. Zacharias is a man in a patriarchal culture. He's someone well respected. He's in a position of honor. He's a high priest. He has a good lineage, and yet when he had the opportunity to truly practice what he said he believed, he didn't. He doubted. And that impacted not God's story. God still works as God works, but it impacted Zacharias' next chapter of his story. Remember what we talked about yesterday? The angel silenced him for a time so that he could do some deeper work of healing and reflection on his own faith journey. Yesterday, I read these words from my favorite passage of the Christmas story that Zechariah wrote after his 9-month exile into silence. So when God puts us into a place of quietness, he's not doing it to punish us, but it's a result of our choices that we need some deeper healing or we need some deeper work. And so at the end of this 9-month period, when God finally released his tongue, he said a bunch of things, but my favorite is this: because of God's tender mercy. 9 months of silence, and yet Zechariah can still say, because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us. He's talking about God's story now. But now Zechariah is fully on board with God's story. Before he wasn't sure. To give light to those who sit in darkness in the shadow of death, and to guide us to the path of peace. So that's Zechariah's story. So today, what I want to talk about is his wife, Elizabeth, and her story. Now, as I said earlier, patriarchy was the norm. It was a man's world. It's still a man's world, but it was far more a man's world there. Men held the power religiously. They held the power politically. They held the power financially. They held the power relationally, family power. So Elizabeth was Zacharias' wife. So let's talk about what her responses were to what happened, to the interruption of her life with these external circumstances of God intervening. Now, we don't know a lot about Elizabeth, but we know a few things. So let's study what we know about who she is. First, she too was descended from a priestly line, from the priestly line of Aaron, and you can't get more pedigreed than that. So Elizabeth was a pedigreed woman. She had blue blood. She had the priestly pedigree in her lineage. She's described in the Bible as a very righteous woman, careful to obey all the Lord's commands and regulations. So here she's got two things going for her. She's got the good background, and she's got a good faith base, In spite of doing all that God required of her, in spite of being from a good family, her life wasn't perfect. Her story was she was barren. She was unable to conceive. And for most women, infertility is tough. But for a woman in biblical times, infertility was a statement about your worth, your value, and it gave a husband a legitimate reason to divorce his wife. Now, I don't doubt that Elizabeth struggled with disappointment at not being able to conceive, but I also think she struggled with feelings of shame, uselessness over her life. If she's not working and women in that culture didn't really work, what'd she do with herself if she's not raising children? And perhaps even she had some despair, not anger, but despair, like, God, why aren't you giving me the desires of my heart? I've done it all right. How much more righteous can I be? How many more boxes do I need to check in order for you to hear my heart? I really long for a baby. Now, Zechariah did not divorce Elizabeth, and that says something about his character as well as hers. But as we learned yesterday, her husband Zechariah doubted the angel's words because he couldn't understand logically, how can this happen? We're old. How can I know for sure what you say is true? Elizabeth's response was different. When Zechariah told her what happened and she got pregnant, she said, how kind the Lord is that I'm pregnant. He's taken away that disgrace of having no children. Yet, it's very interesting that she isolated herself for 5 months. Now, it doesn't say why she did that. Perhaps she felt scared that maybe I might not carry this pregnancy full term. I don't want to let everybody know yet. Maybe she felt a little uncertain to hope for a full term healthy baby at this late age. Elizabeth was in the midst of her own story when an entirely other part of the story was happening that Elizabeth had no awareness of. This same angel, Gabriel, came to Mary about this same time when Elizabeth was isolating. And we'll talk about Mary's story on Friday. But as soon as the angel leaves Mary, and we're not talking about Mary today, Mary decides to quickly go visit. A couple days later, she doesn't go visit her own mother. She goes to visit Elizabeth, which is a relative of hers. And the angel had told Mary that Elizabeth is pregnant too. But Elizabeth had no idea that Mary was coming to visit, nor did she have any idea that Mary was pregnant. Mary wasn't even married. How would she even know that Mary was pregnant? Mary was informed of the two miracles. She would conceive as a virgin, and we'll talk about that on Friday, and that her relative Elizabeth was pregnant. But where Zechariah needed facts to believe, like, how will I know this is sure? We're old. Elizabeth allowed her body to inform her of the miracle. I'm pregnant. I'm old. I have an old body and my body is pregnant. Of course it's a miracle. My body was unable to conceive for years. And my body has received a miraculous healing, not just because of my old age, but because of my infertility. But her body also informs her about Mary's miracle. She didn't know Mary was pregnant. Imagine that your niece, let's say that Mary was her niece, it's said that perhaps she was her niece, comes to you around 15 years old, and she's not married. You don't expect her to be pregnant. And when Mary shows up, the baby within Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy. And Elizabeth knows Mary's pregnant. Now, in that culture, that was a very shameful thing for an unmarried woman to be pregnant. You would think that Elizabeth might have said, Mary, what's going on with you? Why are you here? Are you pregnant? I have some intuition that you might be pregnant. But that's not what she did. Elizabeth intuits Mary's pregnancy. Mary hadn't told her, but Elizabeth was attentive to her body and Mary's body. And what does she do? Not what we would think of in a logical way. She doesn't scold Mary. She doesn't even question Mary. She honors Mary. Again, which is highly unusual for an older woman to honor the younger, for the older to give esteem and more importance to the younger, the married to the unmarried pregnant girl. What does this tell us about who Elizabeth was? She was very special. She had an inner knowing as a woman that she trusted. She didn't just trust God, she trusted herself. And she also trusted herself enough to not bow to people pressure. How many of us bow to people pressure when they start criticizing us, or they start correcting us, or they start challenging us? How many of us have the courage to stand strong with our convictions? Elizabeth did. Remember, after John the Baptist was born, Zacchaeus had written down for Elizabeth everything that the angel had said. And when the baby was born, the neighborhood gathered at the door, all excited about this new baby. And they said, "What are you going to name him? What are you going to name him? What are you going to name him?" And Zechariah couldn't speak. And Elizabeth said, "His name will be John." And they said, "John? John? We've never heard of that name before. What? Why would you name him John? We don't have any relatives around here that name John." And so they challenged her. They shamed her a bit for this name. Wouldn't it be tempting to say, "Well, maybe I misheard. Maybe, what do you think, Zechariah?" She didn't even ask him. She just said, "His name is John," because that's what the angel said his name is. And so the people turned to Zechariah and said, "What do you think? You have the ability, the opportunity to overrule your wife," because in a patriarchal culture, of course he did. And in that moment, Zechariah had changed. 9 months of silence had changed his story inside. And he wrote on the paper, "His name is John." And as soon as he did, his tongue was loosed. Now, what I want to ask you is, how did Elizabeth's boldness, her intuition, her courage, her humility impact her story? What do you think? See, Zacharias' doubt, his logical mind, couldn't wrap around the miracle. Like, how can this be? We're old. How will I know it's sure that you're telling me the truth, angel? Like, how audacious to question the angel. But because Zacharias was operating out of the masculine, logical mind, it didn't make sense to him that his wife could get pregnant at this old age, or that maybe they could even conceive, that he could have sex. Who knows what was going on at that age? But it wasn't possible in his mind. Elizabeth has a very different way of knowing. She knows through her intuition. She knows through her body. She knows in herself what's true and right. And she trusts the Lord. How does that impact her story differently? Her character, how she handles this news, how she responds to the younger, having a more important, prominent position than her. She honors Mary as the mother of my Lord, when maybe she could have been jealous. Like, why did God pick you? You're not married. Why would he pick you to be the mother of the Messiah? He should have picked me. Why do I just get to be the mother of the prophet? She could have gotten caught there. We often do, in comparison, in doubt, in insecurity. So one of the things I want to make clear to you as women who are watching this, most of you are women, is that God has a part for you to play in his story. All right? There was only one man, two women in this story. One man, Zechariah, two women. And then there was, of course, the baby's father, right? So yes, all of a sudden I'm going blank on baby Joseph. Joseph's, I'm not going to talk about him, but he wasn't in this beginning part of the story. One man, or two men, two women. But the women were the ones that were faithful. The women were the ones who obeyed and believed God. But how might the story have ended differently? Jesus would have been born. God would have picked another woman if Mary had said no thanks. God does not depend on you for his story. He invites you to participate in his story, but he also creates and helps you to create the best version of your story. But what happens when you live in fear? What happens when you live in comparison or jealousy or anger, that you've been angry for 40 years that you couldn't conceive? So now it's like, forget it. I don't even want a baby. right? When we live in those negative spaces emotionally, we miss opportunities to participate with God in his story and in rebuilding our story. So if you're a woman here who is stuck in a story you don't like, you cannot change the other people in your story. Elizabeth couldn't change her husband, Zechariah. She couldn't make him believe or do what he was supposed to do. He was going to do what he was going to do. She couldn't make Mary do anything differently. She was just in charge of her part of the story. How was she going to respond to the external events in her life? How was Zechariah going to respond to the external events in his life? We used this chart yesterday. So in writing our story, we sometimes get caught here. Like we don't like this. Like Elizabeth didn't like that she was infertile. Or Zechariah didn't like that he couldn't understand what the angel was really saying. Or Mary may not have liked that she was like a virgin and this was embarrassing. And what are people going to think of her? But it shapes our internal, or maybe your external story is you're not loved as a wife, or you were abused as a child, or you can't find a job, or you have cancer. You still have a story to write about that. How is your story going to be written? Is it going to be written from fear? Is it going to be written from anger? Is it going to be written from emotions that are out of control because you don't understand why this is happening to you? Or is your part of the story going to be written in courage and bravery and faith and forgiveness and love? You get to decide that. And depending on how you decide, that impacts how your story goes in the future. And so we're turning the calendar on 2024. And I know that there are many of you here who are stuck in an unhappy story that you'd like to get out of. And if you have the opportunity to change the circumstances of your story, if Elizabeth could have gone to a fertility doctor and gotten pregnant, I'm sure she would have. So if you have the opportunity to get safe or stand up for yourself or go back to school or get therapy or whatever you have, why aren't you doing it? Why are you staying stuck? You have choices to make. But if you can't change the external circumstances for a season, it might be that you are stuck in a destructive marriage and you're not sure what to do. So how are you going to live out the next year? With bitterness and despair? Or are you going to exercise some muscles of faith and courage and fortitude, not so that your husband changes, so that you don't drown in your upsetting and angry emotions about being in this circumstance, whether you are living in a destructive marriage or you have cancer? It's tempting to get caught in the swirl of our unhappiness about the external reality that we're in versus understanding we have choices about how we're going to live in that external reality. And so here's Elizabeth, the external reality. She's barren, and yet she lives honorably with a situation she doesn't like. Her husband makes a big mistake and he's silenced. And she lives honorably with a husband who's not perfect. She gets pregnant and she lives honorably and trusting God in the midst of that, even while being a bit cautious and isolating herself for 5 months. She has a younger woman come to her who's pregnant, unmarried. It's tempting to scold and shame. In that culture, it would be very tempting. Even in this culture, it's tempting. And she doesn't. What is it about her that knows this is a special pregnancy? She decides to walk in faith and encourage. She doesn't listen to the townspeople about what she should name her child. She listened to the angel and obeyed. So how might your story be different if you took charge of it? That you can't change all the external circumstances. God may be at work in your life in ways that you have no idea. You have no idea what God's up to. Zechariah didn't. Even Elizabeth wasn't quite sure, like, what's John the Baptist going to be doing? I have no idea. Why am I pregnant so old? Why couldn't I have gotten pregnant with this child 40 years ago? I don't know. We don't understand the mind of God. If we could understand the mind of God, we would be God. We just live within the story that he creates for us in ways that make our story something that we don't live with regrets, Like, oh, I had a rotten childhood, and because I was so angry over my childhood, I had a rotten adulthood. And because I was so angry over my adulthood, I had a rotten older age. Because I couldn't let go and move on and build a life now. Because I was so angry at what I didn't have, I couldn't appreciate what I did have. If that's you, and you want to change that, we give you lots of resources and tools on these Facebook Lives for you. But if you really want to be involved in a coaching group, we have a 6-month group coaching program starting in January that I'd love for you to be a part of. It's called Empower to Change. I'm not going to give you a lot of details about it right now, but it's a 6-month intensive small group coaching process that you don't have to leave your living room to go to. You don't have to travel to Arizona or go anywhere else to be there. It's online. It's twice a month for 90 minutes with 12 to 15 other women who are signed up for your group who want to work with a coach on learning to change your story. Again, you can't change God's hand, but you can change and learn to recognize where God's at work. And maybe you're resisting. Maybe you're saying, no, thanks, God, I don't want that. Or I don't understand that, so I don't know how to cooperate with you. We're not going to always understand God. We can't always understand God. And so if you would like some more information about that group coaching program, just go to my website, which is leslievernick.com/change. leslievernick.com/change. And that'll give you a whole page of information about when the times are, what the cost is. Other women who have taken the course will give you some information about it as well, and what we cover in the course. And that will really help you, because one of my passions this year is really helping women own their story. I think for a lot of Christian women, we've lived in a patriarchal culture too, especially in the conservative Christian church, where men have been in charge and they sort of decide for you what your life story is going to be. And I don't really think that's biblical. I think you decide for you. We don't decide all of our life circumstances. Some things we decide, but a lot of circumstances come at us. Right? We don't decide the parents we get. We don't decide sometimes the diseases we get. Sometimes we don't decide, I just drove past a car accident today. That person didn't leave their home deciding to get in a car accident that day. Sometimes things happen to you. You don't decide that. But you decide whether or not you're going to get well. You get to decide if you're in a car accident and your leg gets broken. You decide whether you're going to forgive that person or whether you're going to be angry for the next 2 years. You decide whether you're going to take physical therapy and get your leg better. And if you don't, you live with those consequences. The other person doesn't. So why is it so often that we decide to stay angry, to stay unhealthy because they did that to me? And now our story gets ruined because of our bitter attitude or our helpless feelings. And so if that's you and you lived with this victim mindset, and maybe you have been a victim, a legitimate victim, right? Zechariah and Elizabeth were not victims. Mary wasn't even a victim. She had an opportunity, and she had an opportunity to say no. But some people are victims, and even the scriptures are people who are victims. Jesus was a victim. He was a victim of abuse, of shame, of being profoundly humiliated, of not being believed. And what did he say? Going to the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Now, why did Jesus say that? Jesus is writing his part of the story. He can't control what the soldiers are doing to him. He can't control what Pilate thinks of him. He can't control what Judas did. But he's in charge of his part of the story. And he can't go to the cross with a bitter heart. That's not how he wants his story to go. Jesus represents love, the Father's love. And so he's got to deal with his emotions, his very real human emotions that he would have and I would have and you would have if you were victimized in those ways, right? So Jesus isn't a stone that doesn't have any feelings. He does have feelings just like you. He's a faithful high priest who understands what we go through. But if you've been victimized, I want to give you a sentence. I want you to write this down. Your story is not about what happened to you. You might have been raped. You might have been sexually abused. You might be physically abused in a marriage. You might be not believed by your church. You might be in an oppressive, horrible, patriarchal church and home that's not giving you a voice or a choice. That may be your external circumstance. That may be what's happened to you. That's not your story. That's just what happened to you. That's the framework of your story. That's the circumstances and the character. Your story is what you do with what happens to you. What did Zechariah do with what happened to him? Even after he failed the first test and was silent for 9 months. What did he learn from that? How did he grow from that? That he could write these beautiful words once the angel opened his tongue. What do you do with what happened to you? Does it make you worse and bitter and angry and despairing? Or do you bring the gold out of the dirt? Do you mine for diamonds in the coal? That's totally up to you. We have all been in movies where the movie just didn't go anywhere because the main character was a dud. They never took what they learned, or they never grew from what they experienced. It was just like, that was kind of boring. Or we've been to movies where people really changed and there was bad things that happened to them. In Gladiator, your family gets murdered. In The King's Speech, he can't talk and he's now become the king. In other movies, even like Elsa and Anna and Frozen, they changed and they grew and their story changed as they did. So if you're tired of the story that you're in, just like Elizabeth, she was tired of being barren. She didn't have a choice about that. But she did have a choice about how she was going to be that way. Bitter, angry, despairing, despondent. Apparently she wasn't that. Was she disappointed? Yes. But she was a woman who was righteous in every way, faithful in every way. And she must have also been loving and fun to be around, because in that culture, Zechariah could have said, you're not that fun to be around, Elizabeth, and I don't want to be around you anymore because you can't even provide me with children. He didn't do that. So her character must have shown a beautiful woman in spite of her disappointment. So if that's you and you would love to have the tools to learn how to understand yourself better, to understand your reactions to things so that you can learn to respond instead of reacting, you want to begin to write a different story for 2024, even if you can't control all the characters in your story, you can't control all the circumstances, but you can control how you, as the main character in your story, shows up and handles those things or not. And depending on how you show up and how you handle things, changes the story. You get to decide that. But you can't even decide unless you're aware of it. So I would love to take a little bit of time and answer some questions around this. If you have any questions about this, if you have any questions about Elizabeth's story, or how do you change your story, put them in the chat. If you are coming in from Instagram and you'd like to ask a question, I have someone who's monitoring my feed. And if you could just go to leslievernick.com/question. I think it's /. I think that's what it is. Let me just see what that is. I always forget what that is. leslievernick.com/question/. If you just go there and type it in and send it to that address, then that will get into my feed here and I can answer your question on Instagram as well. All right. So if you can do that, that would be great. And I would love to answer your questions in the remaining time we have. So, Karen, I'm going to look at the questions here, and it looks like we've got a few already. So let me read them out loud. How do you know when it's God telling you? I thought it was with me. I thought it was with me getting married. And now 2 years later, I'm a broken shell of who I know God wants me to be. I am utterly broken, not sure I can be brave internally. I put my brave on in public. I'm not bitter or angry. I'm just drowning in hurt. Okay. So I think it's really important for you to understand, and this takes a little bit of maturity. And I'm going to tell a story first. All right. So I was at a business meeting. I've talked about this story before, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but I think it illustrates your question really well. I was at a secular business meeting, and people ask what you do, and I told them what I do, and they said, "Oh," she goes, "I married a sociopathic narcissist. He was the best husband I could have picked." And I'm like, this was not a Christian conference. She was not a Christian woman. So I'm like, whoa, I've never heard that before. Tell me more. What's your story? Tell me more. She's got a story, right? He's the best husband I could have picked. Tell me more. What's your story, girl? So this is her story. She goes, I grew up in a very home where my mom was very passive. My dad was very domineering. I never learned to speak up for myself. I was just a people pleasing. I was just a giver. I was a nice person. I never had any boundaries. I never had a no. I just wanted everybody to like me. You know the drift. That was her story. And now she marries this guy. She goes, I had to learn fast how to set boundaries. I had to learn how to speak up for myself. Eventually, I had to get away from him. I lost my marriage, but I learned a lot about me. It gave me what I needed to be a strong, healthy person. Now, that's her story. Honest to God. Didn't talk about God, didn't talk about anything about Jesus, any of that. She's saying that this horrible marriage taught her how to be a better person, not a nicer person, a stronger person, strong enough to say, no, I'm getting out of here and I'm not putting up with this, which she would have never known how to do if she didn't have that kind of strong person against her. So she had a choice. How am I going to write this story? Am I just going to let him beat on me? Am I just going to let him crush me and ruin me and wreck my health, wreck my life, wreck my finances, wreck my mental health? Am I going to allow that? Or do I have choices here? Can I say, perhaps God didn't bring this person in my life for me to have a wonderful, safe, trusting relationship. He brought this person in my life for me to learn to say no. And I didn't learn while we were dating. And so now I'm going to have to learn while we're married. And I have to learn now if I want my story to change. Again, you can't change all the characters in your story. And I think this is where women get hung up. It's like, I just want him to change. If he would just change, we'd be fine. You can't control the characters in your story. Elizabeth was responsible for Elizabeth. She wasn't responsible for Zechariah. Elizabeth was responsible for Elizabeth. She wasn't responsible for Mary. Right? And so you are responsible for you. So if you are getting crushed, I don't want you to fake it on the outside. I want you to really write down, what is it costing you to stay? And what are you afraid of? To say, I'm not living like this. I am not living like this anymore. God doesn't want me to be utterly broken by another person. And so why am I giving this person that kind of power and leverage over me to utterly break me? That is not God's will for marriage, and it is not God's will for you. And you have a choice. What stops you from exercising a different choice? That would be my answer to your question. And that may be what you need to learn. Right? That may be how you need to grow to write the new chapter of your story in the new year. Okay? I am divorcing my husband who refuses to end an affair. I know I'm doing the right thing leaving. I have support from my church. I am getting frustrated with those that know the entire story. So I don't know why you're getting frustrated. You didn't say, and I'm not sure what your question is. So I'm just going to make it up in my head. Like this is part of what we get stuck in as women. I need everyone to support me. I need everyone to agree with me. I need everyone to be on board with what my decision is in order for me to be okay. But we learned from Elizabeth, his name is John. And people didn't like that. They weren't on board with her. They didn't agree with her. And she didn't cave. His name is John. So what would be different about your story if you walked forward in strength and dignity, knowing you're doing the right thing by leaving? You have the support from your church. But what if you don't have 100% support from everybody, or they question you? How might you be strong enough to say either, it's really none of your business, or thank you for your concern, and I feel totally comfortable before the Lord that I made the right decision. And not need them to approve you in order to be okay. You see, ladies, if we're going to grow to be courageous and strong, we have to stop needing everybody's approval. And Elizabeth shows us this in her story, that she didn't need their approval for the name she chose for John. And so I think as women, we like everybody to like us. We want everybody to think we're doing the right thing. And we kind of take our, is it okay for me to do this, by everybody else around us. But maybe we need to say, God, is it okay? And we do this in an audience of one. And other people may not like what we have to say. When I came out with my book, The Emotionally Destructive Marriage, 10 years ago, or a little bit longer than that, I wrote in that book that I believed divorce wasn't just the last option. I wrote in that book that sometimes divorce is the best option. I don't think it would ever have been written before from a Christian author, from a Christian publisher in a book, that it was okay. And I totally believed that my career as an author, speaker, and counselor would be over. I thought, I'm going for broke. I'm speaking what God says to speak, and everybody's going to criticize me. And I did get a lot of flack 10 years ago. I'm not getting as much flack today, but I did get a lot of flack 10 years ago. But I wrote what God told me to write, and I didn't feel like I needed to make sure it was okay with everybody. And had I not done that, I don't think I'd be here today telling you about Elizabeth, right? I think this is where you have to take charge of your story. And maybe other people don't want you to have your story, or they're afraid of your story, or they're afraid to be honest, or whatever they're afraid of. That's not your story. Your story is your story. How are you going to write your story? So I like everybody's approval, but I don't need it. I'll be okay. And I'm not going to change my story or change my convictions or change my decision just because you don't like it, right? I'll think about it, but I'm not going to change it. All right. I am feeling very stuck. Not sure Mark 10, 11, and 12 mean what it means, and mentions divorce causes a violence on garments. Passage reads, when they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband, marries another man, she commits adultery. So I'm not prepared in this conversation to unpack all of that, but there are theologians that have. And so I would really encourage you to do some homework. Theology and Therapy and Theology, Lisa Turkhurst's podcast with Joel Muddamalle, unpack that pretty well. I think there's another great book about divorce and remarriage by David Instone Brewer. It's Brewer or Brewster on all of that. But let me just give you the bare bones of what I would think. So what we have to look at, who is Jesus talking to, and why was this question asked, in order to understand his answer, right? So if you're watching a Facebook Live and you just come in here and hear me say something, you just can't take it out of context to this whole conversation that we're having, right? The same thing with the Bible. So they're having this whole conversation, and the religious leaders had two schools of thought, the Hillel school and I can't think of the other. One was very conservative and one was more liberal, Shammai, I think. And so the Hillel school, or the Shammai, one of them said, hey, a man can divorce his wife for any reason because he's the man. You don't have to stay married. If she doesn't cook your dinner the way you like, or she can't have children, or, you can divorce her. It's your right as a man. You get to do that. And that was a part of the Jewish law. The more conservative Jewish law said, oh no, you can only divorce a woman for serious reasons like adultery, unfaithfulness. And understand that the evangelical church, I think, has done a real disservice to women, because they've defined adultery like Bill Clinton. I did not have adultery with that woman, when he did have adultery with that woman. He just didn't have intercourse with that woman, right? But adultery is a much bigger word biblically. God uses the word adultery to talk about what Israel did to him, and he divorces Israel in Jeremiah. So adultery is basic unfaithfulness, a consistent action of unfaithfulness to our marriage vows. It's not just, oh, my husband never had intercourse with another woman, so therefore I have no adultery. I don't believe that. Jesus said, if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery. So adultery is a big word in the scripture. It covers more than just an incident of intercourse with a woman who's not your wife. So let's go back to the context. So the Pharisees are arguing with Jesus about the grounds for divorce. And he said, of course you can't divorce a woman for any reason. That's not, and in fact, a man who divorces his wife for trivial reasons and marries another woman is causing hurt. He's being unfaithful to his partner. So that's the first thing. But also there's a whole other level, and I'm not going into the Hebrew and the Greek right now in the words, but in the Old Testament, there were two different words for divorce. One was a certificate of divorce, and one was a discard divorce. And again, the religious leaders who were more liberal just basically could toss out a wife and marry another woman or get a concubine or whatever. And we see all this in the Old Testament in this patriarchal culture. And just because patriarchy is in the Bible, just like slavery is in the Bible, doesn't make it God's will. It's in the Bible, but it doesn't make it what God wanted. He didn't want men to have multiple wives. So men were having multiple wives, and they were discarding wives that they didn't like. And this is where that verse in Malachi comes up, and he says, I hate when you do that. First of all, you're discarding your wife. You're not even giving them a document of divorce, and they can't remarry, because if they remarry, they're committing adultery, right? And so Jesus, I think, is speaking to this mess of how the Jews were dealing with marriage and divorce. Divorce was not uncommon in Jesus's day. And again, I think we've made an idol out of marriage in our culture, saying the sanctity of marriage is more important to God than the safety and the sanity of the people in it. So I would just encourage you, and this is one of my goals for this year, is Christian women, you need to learn to think for yourself. Don't listen to Leslie Barnick, or don't listen to, you can listen to, I'm glad you're here, but do your own work. You're going to be held accountable for what you do and what you think. And so if you say, well, I heard this from a preacher and that's why I did it, God's going to say, hey, you can read the word yourself, and you've got the Holy Spirit inside of you. So start reading these passages and really ask the Holy Spirit, Holy Spirit, what is true? What are you calling me to? Is this in alignment with your character? So think of this. If we were to pray about slavery, is slavery God's will? Is it in alignment with God's character for there to be people over other people in oppressor and oppressed relationships? No, we know throughout the Old Testament that God hates oppression, and he's always on the side of the underdog. So slavery as an institution where there's oppressors and oppressed, even though it's talked about in the Bible, could not possibly be God's will. Nor is that kind of relationship in marriage God's will. If we think about Proverbs 31, for example, as a picture of a good marriage, the Proverbs 31 woman and her husband, here she is, an independent woman. She makes her own money. She makes her own decisions. She's not a puppet who just is a yes person to his submission and his authority over her life. That's not who she was. It says strength and dignity are her clothing. And she smiles at the future unafraid. But it says he trusts her to do him good, not harm, all the days of his life. And she trusts him. That's the essence, bedrock of a stable marriage, not romantic love. Romantic love is great. But if you don't have safety and trust, romantic love is just intensity and maybe hot sex but it's not a happy marriage. If you have safety and trust, that makes all the difference in the world. And God wants you to have safety and trust. And when that's broken, repeatedly broken without repair, you can't stay in a marriage that's that way without having it impact your body and your mind and your spirit in negative ways. So I hope that helps you to do some homework and think for yourself about this whole topic, because it's that important. All right. How do you deal with regrets for things that you've done? How to think about those biblically, especially when what you did has ongoing consequences in your spouse's life. And now he's doing destructive things, even though I've repented and changed. So Paul is a really good example of someone who had regret. He had regret. He stood by watching Stephen get stoned. He persecuted Christians. He did wrong things. And this is an opportunity for Satan to come in and be the accuser. So Jesus warns us around that, because Satan will attack us with the things that we've done wrong, especially when there has been consequences. And so I think this is really important for you to read through Romans 8. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That doesn't mean that you don't care about the impact your sin has caused someone. So I have a friend who was putting lipstick on her lips in the mirror, and she hit a mother riding a bike and killed her, right? She was very sorry for what she did. She was very repentant. She doesn't put lipstick on the mirror anymore. She pays attention to where she's driving, but the mother's still dead. And she cares about the impact that caused, right? So I think we have to care about the impact that we've caused, and whatever we can do to make amends for that, to do that, pay the hospital bill or to pay the funeral bill or whatever we have to do to make restitution as best we can. We can't bring the mother back, or we can't change his, but he has choices to make too, right? And so don't take responsibility for his choices. So if I hurt someone and I say, hey, I will pay for you to have therapy. I will, make restitution the best I'm able if I'm able to do that. And they say, no, I'm not. I'm going to stay crippled the rest of my life just because of you. Well, then that's their story. That's their choice. Because even if you weren't willing to pay for it, they could still go and get it if they want to be well. So don't take responsibility for their choices to stay dysfunctional, unhappy, bitter because of what you did. They have choices to get healthy too, and to forgive and to deal with it. And so that's part of their story. And that's why I'm so glad you asked this question, because our story impacts someone else's story and their story impacts us. However, we're in charge of what we do with what happened to us. So here's where we talked about this. So you did something to your husband, you have regret, but he's not taking responsibility for how am I handling what happened to me? Am I just going downhill? Am I getting drunk every night because I'm hurting and I'm not willing to go for counseling? Am I taking drugs to medicate myself? Am I paying back evil for evil because you cheated on me? Now I'm going to cheat on you with 10 different women. So that's his story. That's not your fault if he chooses to do that. And I think this is where you don't have to continue to feel responsible that your impact is doing that. He's doing that. His choice to stay on bitterness and unhealthiness about what happened. So here's what happened. I sinned against you, and I'm sorry. And what you do with what happens to that is your story, right? So let's say your husband cheats on you, and you just choose to suck it up and pretend like it didn't happen. How's that going to impact you? How's that going to impact your marriage story? It's going to impact it. Let's say you decide not to suck it up and pretend it didn't happen, and you want to talk about it, and he doesn't want to talk about it. Why do you keep wanting to shame me? Why do you keep wanting to talk about it? Because I need to talk about it to heal. I don't want to. So then what do you do with that? How do you heal? Do you let him decide what you need to heal? Or do you say, well, if I can't talk about it with you, I'm going to have to talk about it with someone else, and I'm going to have to pay for help to get through this because I have been impacted and I need to heal. Right? And so those are the things that we have choices to make. And that's this whole story concept of how we make choices about how people impact us. How did Gabriel impact Zechariah? How did Gabriel impact Elizabeth's life? How did Gabriel impact Mary's life? And what choices did they make that created a different twist to the story? And that's what we're talking about in the Advent season. But that's what I want you to think about for your life too. All right. What does it look like to not act bitter toward your husband when you've been hurt by him and not take your kindness for weakness or thinking things are okay? Is there a conversation that can be had to let him know that you've forgiven him and you don't want to be bitter, but you can't move forward in the marriage until he gets serious help? My history is that when I show kindness, even in my pain, he acts like everything is good and stops changing. He's a covert narcissist, and it's so hard not to be angry and bitter. So I think this is really important that you do not attach your character to how he responds, right? So I have to act mean and ugly for him to get it. No, you don't. He can get it if you just speak the truth in love. He may not choose to, but he can if he wants to, right? So you don't have to ruin your character in order for him to get it, because he's not really getting it. He's just complying to get you to be nice to him again, right? He's not really repentant, because if he were repentant, he would be caring about the impact his behavior has had on you. And I don't hear that in your question, all right? So here's how I might be. I might decide, how do I want to show up with this person? So it might be, I want to be kind and generous where I want to be. And I want to have a firm no and really good boundaries where I need to be. So what might that look like in a conversation? Hey, I'm making pizza tonight. Do you want some? I'm kind and generous. Sure, I have some. Good. All right, I'll make some more. Hey, you want to go for a walk? No, I don't want to go for a walk. I don't feel like we have any productive conversations, and I'm not willing to do that. Hey, you want to have, sex? No, I don't want to. I'm not ready for that. I don't feel like our relationship is repaired anywhere close to having sex with you. I don't feel safe with you. I don't feel like I can trust you. I can eat pizza with you, but I can't do that. So that's what it would look like. You don't have to be bitter. You don't have to be angry. You just have to be really firm. You have to know what your boundaries are, what you will do, what you won't do, how you can show up in kind and generous ways, and how you are not going to give anything of something that's going to cost you in terms of hurt and pain or vulnerability if he tramples on it. So that's how you do it. And he's not going to like that. But you may feel better about that. Right? Hardest part is when I do give my power over to him, how do I not let that external in to my internal? So I didn't get angry, hurt, resentful. I know it's a choice, but it's so hard to not ever let it into my internal. Working hard at that. How do you not give up your power and not let his external become my internal? So this is kind of a tricky question. So I'm going to pull the board up for those of you who are watching. So what she's talking about is this stuff aggravates the heck out of us, especially when you're living with someone who aggravates the heck out of you, right? So the external is bugging you. So I'll just share my story today. So I went to the eye doctor yesterday for my eyes, and he wasn't there. And I said, well, why didn't you call me to cancel? Oh, we usually don't do that. We didn't get to it. We have another doctor to see. I said, I didn't make an appointment with that doctor. I made an appointment with this doctor. Well, he's not here today, so I'll have to come in tomorrow. So this external aggravated me, and I was feeling frustrated, right? My time is valuable to me, and I didn't feel like taking an hour out of my day to not get my eyes checked, okay? So it's not that you're never going to feel those feelings. All right, today I went to the eye doctor and I got my eyes examined, and he put contacts in, and I could hardly drive home. They were the wrong contacts. So I felt aggravated again, okay? All right, so now I'm aggravated at this person. So I get to decide here. It's not that I'm not going to feel these feelings. You're going to feel your feelings, okay? It's not, but I get to decide, is this who I want to be and how I want to show up? Or do I need to deal with these feelings, acknowledge them, admit them, show compassion? Yeah, it stinks that your contacts aren't right. It stinks that they aren't as competent as you would like at this eye doctor place. Maybe I need to find a new eye doctor. All of that. I'm acknowledging reality. And am I going to let this cause me to act rude and belligerent and nasty to the people at the eye doctor office, to my husband when I get home, to the traffic on the way home? Well, it depends. It depends on whether I recognize that this is where I am right now, and I'm not going to beat myself up for that. It's legitimate, external, but bothered me. But I decide. So this is my feeling self. Okay, this is my feeling self. And this, not external, this is me. I decide how I want to be. This doesn't decide. I'm aware I feel these feelings, and I decide what I want to do with them. And that's how you begin to work on it. It's not that you don't ever feel those feelings. Of course you do. Of course you do, especially if you're married to someone who's provocative, selfish, or cruel, or indifferent. And sometimes it's overwhelming and you can't possibly live peaceably with that person. That's a red flag for you to know that that's not a good place to be. But you get to decide then, okay, I am not able to live with this person without constantly feeling frustrated, aggravated. What do I need to do to take care of me? Marriage isn't peaceful, safe, loving, trusting. It's none of those. What do I need to do now to take care of me? Because our marriage is broken and he doesn't want to look at that. So, okay, I can't fix him. I can only fix me. I don't want to be broken. And I'm getting broken down trying to live in a broken down marriage. It's like living in a house that has toxic fumes. Okay, let's fix the toxic fumes. I'm like getting sick. No, we're not fixing the toxic fumes. I can manage it. You should be able to manage it. I don't want to live in a house with toxic fumes. I'm moving out. I'm not living like this. And I think that's an important thing for you to be able to decide. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have other considerations, children, your faith, all of those kind of things. But I think so often we just default to, oh, there's nothing I can do. That's not true. That's not true. There's lots you can do. Starting with, how do I want to show up here? And how do I want to handle these toxic feelings I'm having? so that they don't spew out on everybody else. And sometimes we do a good job of that. And sometimes we just let them spew out a bit, like I did yesterday with the doctor's office, right? I was a little cranky. I mean, I wasn't mean, but I was just a little, I wasn't my normal kind self. I was a little bit short-tempered and a little bit like, why didn't you call me? You know, a little bit aggravated. They could tell I was aggravated. And I didn't feel that was sinful. I just felt like I wish I would have had better ability to stop myself in the moment, but I didn't. And I didn't beat myself up. I just let it go and moved on to the next chapter. All right. So you don't have to condemn yourself. Just be aware. Wow, I could have handled myself a little bit better there. Or maybe I didn't get enough sleep the night before. What do I need to do to continue to work on this? And you'll learn all this in the 6-month group coaching program if this is something that appeals to you. Okay. All right. We've got one more question. How do I start from zero at age 42? How do I learn a new way to be useful in a new career while going through a divorce? Well, I think a new career, I mean, unless you financially need to do that step as well, might be a big jump from learning to be healthy and learning to be on my own to having to also build a new career. Women have done it. We have lots of women in our Conquer membership who have gotten divorced, gone back to college, gotten an education, gotten a good job, and done great. They've done great. So I think you have to know what your capacity is and what your energy levels are and what your other responsibilities are, littles, all that kind of thing, whether you have to manage their feelings going through a divorce. But I do think that you're having a belief in your head, and the belief is something like this. Let me just see if I can get some paper towels to rinse off this board a little bit. The belief is this, and this belief is what writes our story, right? Like Zechariah couldn't believe the angel, and so that affected and impacted the way he interacted in the story. So when we have a belief, and the belief is, I can't, I'm too old. Okay. So if we have this belief, and this is the very first thing we start working on in Empower to Change, is our beliefs that are really lies. All right. But we don't know that. We just believe them. Like when I was 20 years old, I had a belief. When I was 21 years old, I graduated with my master's degree and I was invited to consider a PhD. And I said, oh, no, I can't. I'm not too old, but I can't write. That's what I told myself. I can't write. I could never write a dissertation. I'm not smart enough. I'm not a good enough writer. That's what I told myself. And I believed it. And so my story went, I didn't go for my PhD. Not because I couldn't have, but because I believed I couldn't have. And then I believed I couldn't write. Now I've written 7 books and lots of things since then. Lots of chapters in books, lots of articles, lots of all kinds of things. Obviously I could write, but I didn't believe I could write. And that impacted my life for 20 years. I never wrote anything because that's what I believed. It wasn't true, but I believed it. And we live what we believe. My friend Sandra Wilson said, we don't always live what we profess. Like, oh, I profess God loves me, but we live what we believe. I'm just garbage. I'm unlovable. And it's hard to say that out loud sometimes as Christians, but I worked with so many women in counseling. I know that some of you listening have those beliefs. I'm too far gone. I'm too old. I'm too stupid. I can't. And you have these beliefs, and we unpack all these because we live what we believe. And so if you believe you're too old and you can't, then you won't. Like I didn't for 20 years. I didn't start even thinking about my first book until I was in my 40s. And it wasn't that I wasn't capable before then, but I didn't believe I was capable. And because you don't believe you're capable, then you don't even try, right? And so I would just encourage you to think about these. How do I start from zero at age 42? Now, I'm sure you're not starting from zero. That's another belief that you have, like you're an infant. You're not an infant. There's lots of skills and abilities you have. There's lots of things you've done in your life that I'm sure you've succeeded at. You can learn a new way. So let me ask you a question. What have you learned recently? Have you learned to play the piano? Have you learned to exercise? Have you learned to memorize scripture in some way? What small thing did you learn this year? Did you learn to cook cookies in a way that you never learned to cook cookies before? Did you learn to garden? What did you learn that you can learn? You can learn. You're not too old to learn. I can still learn. It's amazing what I can still learn. So be careful of the things that you tell yourself that make you feel you can't. All right. So I'm going to go for now. I'm going to be back on Friday morning at noon Eastern time to do Mary. What was her story? How did that impact God's story and Jesus' story? All right. So thank you so much for giving me this time. I so appreciate you being here. And I will be back on Friday. We have other Facebook Lives this week with our coaches. So if you're interested in the Changing the Story, Change the Life, please tune in into their things. They'll give you some specific skills and tools to do that. And visit the website at leslievernick.com/change if you want to know more about the group coaching program. All right. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.